Good morning. This is a video presentation having to do with the Specialized Terminology Glossary, as well as with the examples that have been posted and some of the subtle differences between the assignment that was originally the source of those examples and the new one that we're using. So make sure to pay close attention so that you're using the right set of guidelines. Our current assignment focuses on individual words and pieces of terminology. It looks for evidence of other characteristics of the discourse community in each of the words or pieces of terminology that you decide to discuss. Remember that each of these should show that there are common public goals. Each of these should show that the discourse community has ways for its members to communicate. Each of these should show that members get feedback and information through their participation in that discourse community. Each of these terms should show that the discourse community uses and owns the ways in which important communication happens in order to further the goals of its membership. Each term should show the importance of having a body of specialized terms and terminology. Of course, that goes without saying. That's the reason that specialized terms exist. Finally, each of these terms should distinguish full members by their understanding of the content of the ability and their ability to discuss that content as it pertains to the entire field. So then, really what our current assignment is doing is showing the discourse community through the prism of individual words and terms. This means that the important questions to answer with each of the terms that we discuss are, number one, how does it reflect what everyone in the field, career, or workplace wants? Number two, how does it facilitate communication within the field, career, or workplace? Number three, how does it reflect how well one understands the field, career, or workplace? Number four, is it tied to some means of communication within the field, career, or workplace? And number five, does it reflect upon the level of expertise or membership in the field, career, or workplace of the person who's using it? Now note that I've only mentioned 5 characteristics here because of the fact that we're taking one of those for granted. And again, that one we're taking for granted is the existence of a specialized body of terms, terminology, and jargon. Right? So if we're working with that taken for granted, then really we just need to look at the way that the other 5 characteristics are reflected in the individual terms, and that's exactly what we're doing here. I'd like to take an example term from my own field, and that term is trauma-informed pedagogy, and discuss that as an example of the sort of development that I'm asking all of you to work on doing with the terms that you choose. Trauma-informed pedagogy is a name for the way of teaching that takes into account the long-lasting effects of traumatic, and that is mentally, physically, or both traumatic, events in a student's life. This reflects the fact that all educators are looking for better ways of understanding what their students need and want. This is evidence of the fact that current pedagogical, that is having to do with the study and practice of teaching, current pedagogical research is focusing more and more on the potential for non-cognitive, and by non-cognitive I mean not having to do with the intellect, cognitive performance, or cognition, influences change a student's ability to learn. Now, a term such as this gets simultaneously to the practices of the instructor and also for the reasons for those practices, at what one does in the classroom, and at the philosophy behind it. This is important because it allows for communication about praxis, or the practical application of theoretical knowledge. Instructors are almost always doing this when they discuss their teaching with each other. We often share the same base of theoretical knowledge, but apply it very differently based on the individual instructor, based on the individual classroom, and based on the individual class even. This 3-word phrase, trauma-informed pedagogy, refers to an entire body of research on what students go through, how it affects them, how instructors should think about it, and finally, what it means to teach based on that knowledge. Trauma-informed pedagogy reflects a significant amount of experience and understanding of teaching. Much time is spent by instructors who are new to the classroom trying to interpret students' academic work as a direct indicator of how well those instructors are teaching. Some of the academic work has to do with this, however, to think it all does is a mistake. Much more goes into the academic work students generate than just the teaching of the individual instructor. Accepting that there are forces beyond the instructor's control that shape the work the instructor students do can be difficult and is often a sign of progress in one's ability to do one's job. The term trauma-informed pedagogy came to widespread usage through three means of communication that are tied to the discourse community of college English teachers. Those are the scholarly journal article, books, and conference presentations. In my own specific situation, it was the conference presentation that was the most effective in allowing me to understand and use the terminology. Prior to that conference presentation, I did have some working knowledge of the concept of trauma-informed pedagogy, but there wasn't enough of that to allow me to benefit from it or really be able to use it in my teaching. Finally, the usage of such a term as this by an educator tends to reflect some expertise on the part of the person using it. The fact that there are discrete, coherent ways of teaching can be difficult to accept until one learns it for oneself. Before that point, oftentimes we assume that the only way of teaching is the one we have. Also, the teaching practices necessary to employ this pedagogical approach reflect care and planning, which go beyond the subject matter of the course. Again, for a new educator, oftentimes just managing that subject matter seems like enough of a task in and of itself. To go beyond that and start thinking about the way it's presented is, once again, usually a mark of an expert educator. Finally, there is often a popular culture misunderstanding of education that portrays it as a way of leaving one's past entirely behind. This pedagogical approach is predicated on the impossibility of doing so. The old stereotype is once one has one's education, one can transcend all of one's past. That's not the case. That past always shapes what we're capable of doing. To get back to the assignment itself, remember that the general expectations are that we discuss 7 to 10 terms, that the discussion of each term finds as much evidence of as many of the other 5 characteristics of the discourse community as possible, and lastly, that each term becomes a reflection of what it means to be a current, active, growing, self-aware member of the field, career, or workplace. I've posted 2 good examples of this kind of writing to Blackboard, but like I said at the beginning, both examples were originally written based on a slightly different assignment, and so I want to make sure that we understand what parts of those examples to look at versus what parts we want to perhaps look at less closely because they don't quite apply to our assignment the same way. Now, these are fine pieces of writing, and they're about the same subject matter broadly. They're written, though, for an assignment that, first and foremost, took all of the characteristics of the discourse community and was supposed to be looking at them each individually in basically the same amount of focus. Otherwise, with the original former assignment that these things are written for, it's important to note that Swales, the author of the piece that originally described a discourse community, was writing for an academic audience about an academic audience. Now, what that means then is that though all characteristics are true for any given group of people who all share a similar interest, these are usually most easily recognized in groups of professional academic scholars who all share a same focus, and clearly that doesn't describe us all. We're not all professional academic scholars, and we're not yet members of a disciplinary academic, scholarly, or career community yet. Because most of us are headed in that direction, but not all of us know exactly what discipline or field we're going into, we don't necessarily have the body of experience or knowledge that Swales is counting on in his article. So that's the reason that I've moved away from having all 6 characteristics discussed in the same amount of detail. In short, we don't have all of those characteristics yet. We haven't necessarily experienced them for ourselves, so it's just difficult to talk about them. Some characteristics of a discourse community were also more true when the essay was originally written than they are now, and this has a lot to do with electronic communication. Electronic communication has served to make communication amongst members of a discourse community much more homogeneous. People email for a lot of different reasons to accomplish a lot of different things these days, and that's because of the versatility of the tool. You can simply do a lot with it. Before, there were oftentimes different ways of communicating where different reasons existed, but like I said, because email is so versatile, a lot of those things have just become email. The first example listed is on the EMS community and the terminology that goes along with it. Now, I just want to point to some of the good things to observe here. Number one, the essay goes directly into a discussion of the terminology, and this means that it's very focused from the very get-go. The terms reflect on various different various different levels of membership, and the terms are analyzed to show how they help communication happen more quickly and efficiently, and that's one of the most important things any specialized terminology can do for us. The author's taken some liberties with the organization of the paper, but that's so that the most important aspects of it are presented first. The paper also identifies the ways in which EMS community members continue to grow and change the way that any member of any field, career, or workplace would need to. The other example I've got posted has to do with the Wegmans discourse community and the terminology that goes along with it. Now, it's important to note here that this is evidence that we don't just have to be talking about academic pursuits. This concerns the sort of job that could either be limited employment or a full career, either one. The essay is logically organized based on the order of the original discourse community characteristics, and this is useful because it means the whole thing's very easy to navigate. You know exactly where everything is and is going to be. The character intersperses terminology and jargon throughout the other points as a way of showing how integral these things are to the ideas of the community itself. The writing is simple and direct, and wherever possible, the writing looks at terminology and jargon as facilitating communication between lower-level and upper-level employees. So, if you find yourself writing about a career community, that's something to consider looking for. Finally, the writing also identifies those terms or pieces of jargon that are reflective of the different genres of communication. I want to think about some takeaways then from both this discussion and the assignment in more general. First and foremost, look at the assignment. Make sure you're following those guidelines. Otherwise, whatever you write is simply not going to work in its first form. After that, use a field, career, or workplace that you're invested in and care about. And really, this is a version of the larger advice that if you don't care about your topic, the writing's not going to work. Choose terminology and jargon that you find interesting and do some digging if necessary. This is the sort of thing that comes before the research itself. You might just do a Google search for terminology in your field, and after you've got that, your actual sourcing would have to do with where the terminology comes from and what it means. But just finding the terms doesn't really need to be a research source. Again, that's just a Google thing, oftentimes leading you to a source like Wikipedia. Now, speaking of the things we do even before the draft itself, do some pre-draft planning. Make sure that structure, organization, and content are all working together. This is the reason that I'm asking you to post a preliminary outline. It's going to help you to make sure that everything is organized in such a way that it's just as easy for you to think about and write as it will be for me to read it at the end. Now, don't make the writing more complex than it has to be. Generally speaking, the more complex the ideas are that you're working with, and they could get pretty complex, the simpler the writing needs to be so that the reader has kind of a life raft, right? The writing has to be simple so that if the ideas are complex, the reader can still follow the writing. Keep the writing straightforward and make sure that it sounds like you. Writing that doesn't sound like you often doesn't sound like anything because it's so complex you can't make heads or tails of what it's saying. The last thing I want to leave you with here is, again, make sure that you're always looking for evidence of as many of the 5 points as you can in any term that you're discussing. As long as you're doing that consistently, the essay should work well and look good both in original and final form. For now, I've taken almost 15 minutes of your time. Thank you in advance for watching and listening to this, and I'll talk to everybody soon.